Chapter 1, The Early Years. My mother, Violet Artis, was born in Faro, Mississippi in 1900. Faro does not exist today. Our mother had very little education. Our grandfather, Robert Morris, my mother's father, insisted that she was needed to help on the farm. In our grandpa's opinion, there were functions that could be performed by a small child that would be helpful to the family working on a farm in the South, a farm they did not own. My grandparents were sharecroppers. Sharecropping was the way Jim Crow law kept black people in poverty after slavery was outlawed. Sharecroppers were forced to sign agreements that ensured they continued in debt to the landowners. It looked good on the outside. The landowners supplied the land and the seed, tools, and a mule. However, since the farmers were forced to do business with a plantation store on credit, they were entitled to only a small portion of the crop proceeds. Sharecropping ensured that the farmers stayed under the landowner's thumb. Children were family, sure, but just like adults, they were labor. A child of 5 was expected to pick cotton. The child would drag a bag as big as a calf up and down the rows, plucking cotton balls from plants and placing them in the bag. A small child would feed the chickens, if the family was lucky enough to own any. They were also expected to gather cow dung from the main farms to burn as fuel. In the rural South of my mother's childhood, nearly 40% of all children died before adulthood. Children of that era were loved, necessary, and sadly too often expendable. My father's name was James Artis. James and Violet were older when they married. Daddy was 42, Mama was 30, typical of the time. They immediately had children. In total, Mama bore 9 children. Again, as was usual for the times in the South among black people, she lost 4 children at birth. Those that survived were Lavinia, Howard, Robert, Jesse, and the baby, me, Willie Artis. In the early 1920s, Mama told our father that she had to get out of Mississippi. After a lengthy discussion, my parents agreed that St. Louis made good sense. They decided that Daddy should head to St. Louis by way of Memphis, as my mother had relatives there. This would give my father a home base for a while. He could find a little work, save some money, and then continue to St. Louis. My father left for St. Louis in 1928. It was a big day. Black people did not travel far in the South in the Jim Crow era. As planned, Daddy stopped in Memphis. My mother's Uncle George met Daddy at the station. Uncle George convinced him to stay and look for real work. Just like today, family looked after family. Daddy stayed with them until he found a good job. It took him several weeks, but he finally settled into a place at Jones Lumber as a carpenter and glass cutter. Living with the family, he could set a few dollars aside. With that bit of a nest egg, he sent for my mother and my older sister, Lavinia. Still, my parents really wanted to move to St. Louis. It's 300 miles from the south side of Memphis to St. Louis. Given the economics of the Jim Crow era, it may as well been 3,000 miles. My parents never saved enough money to reach their destination. Therefore, my parents decided to remain in Memphis and raise the family. My mother had saved some money from her days of work while living in Mississippi. As an adult, Mama worked on her father's farm for pay. When Mama made it to Memphis, our parents rented a large house in South Memphis. The house had many rooms, and my mother decided to turn this house into a boarding house and rent the rooms to earn additional income for the family. She rented only to single working men. No job, no room. In return, she would provide 1 meal per day to the renters. Mama grew what she could in her garden, beans, potatoes, greens. What she couldn't grow, she got at the market. Between Mama's room and board and Daddy's pay from the lumber company, the small family got by. Within several years, between the money my mother earned and my father's hard work, the family bought their own house. They found a small home in the Klondike section of town. It was no small feat for a black family in that area to own their own home. Klondike was the black part of town. No white people. Not just by choice, but by law. Jim Crow laws borrowed integrated neighborhoods. The only white people we saw were women picking up laundry from a neighbor. Mrs. Cooper, a true entrepreneur in her own right, had a linen laundry business in the rear of her home. She made a financial contribution to her family. White women from other neighborhoods would bring their dirty linen and pick up clean linen on a weekly basis from Mrs. Cooper. Imagine a black woman in the 1920s and 30s had her own business.